Somewhere inside a NOAA supercomputer right now, a number is climbing, slowly, quietly. And almost nobody in mainstream media is talking about what that number means, because the last time it climbed this high, this fast, with this many independent systems agreeing, somewhere between 30 and 50 million people stopped existing. More deaths than every soldier killed in the First World War, combined, from a weather pattern. And here's the part that should make you genuinely uncomfortable. The scientists who studied that catastrophe didn't blame the weather alone. They blamed a very specific three-part ocean configuration. And as of this week, all three parts are moving into position again. Stay with me until the end, because what's assembling in the data right now has a name. And it's time someone said it out loud. If this already has you thinking, hit like and subscribe to the Sky Lab, because this story is going to keep developing as new data comes in over the next several months, and you will want to be here when it does. Now let us get into it. Part 1. The forecast that shouldn't exist. The ocean is quiet right now. Not metaphorically quiet. Literally, measurably, statistically quiet. If you pull up the Oceanic Niño Index today and look at the number sitting in the most recent column, you will see something close to negative 0.16 degrees Celsius. That is a number so close to zero that most climate scientists would shrug and call it neutral. Not warm, not cold, not interesting. Just the ocean, doing its thing, drifting along in a state of unremarkable equilibrium that would make any forecast desk look at it and decide there's nothing particularly urgent to discuss this week. So here's the problem. The models don't agree with the ocean. Not one model. Not a rogue outlier running some experimental physics on a server farm in Boulder, Colorado. We are talking about the two most closely watched, most institutionally trusted, most independently constructed climate forecast systems on the planet. NOAA's Climate Forecast System version 2, known as CFSV2, and the North American Multi-Model Ensemble, known as the NMME, and both of them, right now, in the late spring of 2026, are pointing at the same number, a number that, the last time the real world actually produced it, ended more lives than the combined military fatalities of the First World War. That number is positive 2.0 degrees Celsius, or higher, in the Niño 3.4 index. And the models aren't suggesting it as a tail risk. They're not burying it in the fine print of the probabilistic spread. They're walking toward it with the kind of quiet, methodical confidence that tends to make the people who read these outputs for a living get very still and very focused. Now, before we go any further, I want to be precise about something, because precision is going to matter enormously in this conversation. The Niño 3.4 index is the standard measure climate scientists use to define El Niño events. It measures sea surface temperature anomaly, meaning the departure from average, in a specific region of the central Pacific Ocean, roughly between 5 degrees north and 5 degrees south latitude, and between 170 degrees west and 120 degrees west longitude. When that number climbs above positive 0.5 degrees Celsius for 5 consecutive overlapping 3-month periods, you officially have an El Niño. When it climbs above positive 1.5, you have a strong El Niño. When it climbs above positive 2.0, you have crossed the threshold into what scientists call a Super El Niño, a category that has only been confirmed 3 times in the modern instrumental record. 1982 to 83, 1997 to 98, and 2015 to 16. The models right now are not projecting a modest El Niño. They are not projecting a strong El Niño. The central estimate in the CFSV2 ensemble is sitting between positive 2.1 and positive 2.2 degrees Celsius at peak. Some ensemble members are running as high as positive 2.5 to positive 3.0, and when I tell you that the NMME, an entirely separate modelling system built on different physics, different parameterizations and different initial conditions, is independently converging on the same range, that convergence is not a footnote. That convergence is the story. Here is why that matters, and why it's genuinely unusual. Climate forecast systems are not magic. They are numerical models, collections of equations describing how the ocean and the atmosphere exchange heat, moisture, and momentum over time. They make mistakes. They have known biases. They disagree with each other constantly, especially at long lead times, because small errors in initial conditions compound as the forecast runs further into the future. The normal state of affairs in ENSO forecasting, ENSO standing for El Niño Southern Oscillation, The broader climate phenomenon that El Niño is part of is uncertainty, spread, and inter-model disagreement. You get one model saying strong El Niño, another saying weak, another saying neutral, and the forecast is essentially trying to read the collective weight of the ensemble like a jury that can't quite reach a verdict. What we have right now is not that. What we have right now is something much rarer. Independent systems built by different institutions using different methodologies, arriving at the same conclusion from different starting points. And the conclusion they are arriving at is not comfortable. But here's the part that should make you lean in a little closer. This convergence is happening now, during what climate scientists call the spring predictability barrier. That phrase sounds technical and bureaucratic, but it describes one of the most inconvenient facts in all of atmospheric science. Every spring, roughly between February and May in the Northern Hemisphere, the ability of climate models to accurately forecast El Niño events drops to its lowest point of the year. The statistical skill of ENSO forecasts, meaning the degree to which they outperform a simple random guess, falls off a cliff during this window. It happens because of a real physical phenomenon. The coupling between the ocean and the atmosphere in the tropical Pacific is weakest during boreal spring, which means the signal the models are trying to detect is partially buried under natural variability. Forecasters know this. It's not a bug in the models, it's a feature of the real climate system. And historically, many El Niño forecasts that looked convincing in the spring have simply failed to verify by autumn. So we have two of the most trusted modelling systems on Earth converging on a Super El Niño forecast, during the period of the year when ENSO forecasts are statistically the least reliable, from a starting point where the ocean itself currently reads as neutral. That combination of factors should, under normal circumstances, produce a lot of caveats and a lot of hedging. Instead, the IRI, the International Research Institute for Climate and Society at Columbia University, which maintains one of the most widely cited ENSO probability forecasts in the world, is currently showing roughly 70% El Niño probability already, rising toward 90% or higher as the year progresses, 70% during the spring predictability barrier, from a neutral ocean, with independent systems agreeing. That's not normal, and the reason I'm sitting here telling you about a number on a forecast chart is not because I find Pacific sea surface temperature projections inherently cinematic, though honestly, once you understand what they mean, they are. The reason I'm telling you about this is because of a peer-reviewed paper published in 2018 in the Journal of Climate, authored by Singh and colleagues, which did something the mainstream climate conversation has not fully absorbed. It looked backward at the worst drought in recorded human history, an event that occurred between 1876 and 1878, and it used modern climate attribution methods to figure out exactly what caused it. Not approximately, not vaguely, exactly. And what it found was not just an El Niño. What it found was a very specific configuration of three ocean basins acting together in a way that amplified each other's effects into something the climate system had not produced before and has not fully reproduced since. And as of right now, in the spring of 2026, all three of those basins are beginning to move in the direction that Singh et al. Described. I want to be careful here, because careful is the only honest way to talk about this. We are not in 1877. The alignment is not complete. The models carry significant uncertainty. The spring predictability barrier is real and relevant. There are a dozen ways this forecast could fail to verify, and some of those ways are quite plausible. No one in the peer-reviewed scientific literature is currently predicting a famine. No one is saying 50 million people are going to die. That is not what this is. What this is something more specific and in some ways more unsettling. It is the recognition that the data right now, the ocean temperatures, the subsurface heat content, the basin-by-basin trend lines, are assembling themselves into a configuration that science has explicitly identified as the mechanism behind the deadliest climate event in the modern record. And the mainstream conversation about the coming El Niño is almost entirely focused on whether it will happen and how strong it might be, while almost no one is asking the question that the Singh et al. Paper makes unavoidable. What happens if the other two basins finish lining up? That is the question this whole conversation is about, not a prediction of catastrophe, not a claim that history is repeating itself, but a careful, honest look at a pattern that climate science says we should take seriously, a pattern that is forming right now, quietly, in the data, while the discourse mostly talks about whether we'll have a dry summer. So let's start with the number. The specific number the models are converging toward. because once you understand what that number represents and where it sits in the historical record, the rest of this starts to make a lot more sense and a lot more weight. Part 2. The number the models are walking toward. Positive 2.1 degrees Celsius doesn't sound like much. It sounds like the kind of number you'd find in the fine print of a meteorology textbook or in a chart that scrolls past during a television weather segment while you're pouring your morning coffee. It sounds like a small, technical decimal point kind of problem, the kind that belongs to scientists and not to anyone who has to actually live in the world. But that number in the Niño 3.4 index is not a small technical problem. It is the threshold at which the Pacific Ocean stops being a background condition of the global climate system and starts being an active force that reorganizes it. And the models right now aren't just flirting with that threshold. They're projecting that we will cross it, pass through it, and potentially push well beyond it before the peak of the event arrives. Let's talk about what the ensemble actually looks like, because the shape of a forecast matters as much as its central estimate. In any major climate modelling system, you don't run the model once. You run it dozens or hundreds of times, each time with slightly different starting conditions, in order to sample the range of outcomes that the physics of the system will allow, given the current state of the ocean and atmosphere. The collection of all those runs is called an ensemble, and the spread of the ensemble tells you something crucial: how much confidence you should place in the central estimate. A tight ensemble, one where most runs cluster close to the same value, suggests that the outcome is being strongly constrained by current conditions. A wide ensemble, one where the runs scatter across a broad range of values, suggests that small differences in initial conditions are producing large differences in outcome, which means the system is sensitive and uncertain. The CFSV2 ensemble right now is showing a central estimate, meaning the average of all its runs, of somewhere between positive 2.1 and positive 2.2 degrees Celsius in Niño 3.4 at peak. But the ensemble members are not uniformly clustered there. The upper tail of the distribution, the runs that are producing the warmest outcomes, is reaching positive 2.5 to positive 3.0 degrees Celsius in some iterations. That upper tail is not the most likely outcome. It represents the high-end scenarios within the model's physics. But the fact that those runs exist, and that they are being produced by the same model in its high-sensitivity configurations matters. Because in the history of ENSO forecasting, the upper tail of the CFS V2 ensemble has occasionally been right. Now, here is where the comparison with historical Super El Niño events becomes genuinely important, because context is everything when you're trying to assess what a number means. The 1982-83 El Niño peaked at roughly positive 2.2 degrees Celsius in Niño 3.4. It was, at the time, the strongest El Niño in the instrumental record and produced severe disruptions to global weather patterns across multiple continents. The 1997-98 event, which held the record as the most powerful El Niño ever measured until the mid-2010s, peaked at approximately positive 2.4 degrees Celsius. It caused catastrophic drought in Indonesia, Australia, and parts of Africa, triggered devastating flooding across South America and East Africa, and contributed to economic losses estimated in the tens of billions of dollars. The 2015-16 event matched and in some indices slightly exceeded the 97-98 event, and it did so in a world that was already roughly 1 degree Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial baseline, which meant the absolute sea surface temperatures involved were correspondingly higher. What the current forecast is projecting, a peak of positive 2.1 to 2.2 at the central estimate, with the possibility of 2.5 or higher, puts this event in the same magnitude class as both of those historical benchmarks. And that comparison is not reassuring, because even the 1997-98 event, the one climate scientists routinely use as the reference case for a Super El Niño, did not have the multi-basin configuration that Singh et al. Identified in the 1876-78 event. The 97-98 El Niño was devastating, but it was one basin acting alone, or close to it. There is something important to understand about the acceleration pattern the models are showing, because it tells you something about the physical mechanism driving this event. The forecast trajectory curves are not showing a gradual linear warming from neutral to Super El Niño. They are showing a pattern consistent with a rapid warming phase expected in the middle of 2026, followed by a peak in the northern hemisphere late autumn and early winter. That rapid acceleration signature is physically meaningful. It suggests that the event is not being driven primarily by atmospheric variability, by random wind fluctuations that happen to warm the surface ocean, but by the ocean itself, by heat that is already stored in the subsurface of the Western Pacific and is being released through a mechanism that the physics of the climate system almost always completes once it starts. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this forecast, and I'll come back to it in just a moment. First, let me address the model bias question directly, because it's a legitimate concern and I don't want to wave it away. The CFS-V2 has a known tendency to overshoot El Niño peaks in its long-range forecasts. This is a documented characteristic of the model, and the people who use it professionally know to apply a mental correction when interpreting its output. If the model says 2.2, the experienced forecaster might mentally discount that to something like 1.8 or 2.0 when constructing a consensus view. That is a real and appropriate caveat. But here's what makes this particular situation different from the generic case of CFSV, being enthusiastic about El Niño, the NMME. The North American Multimodal Ensemble is not CFSV2. It is a collection of multiple independently developed models from different institutions, including the Canadian Meteorological Centre, the National Centres for Environmental Prediction, GFDL, and others, each built on different code, different physical parameterizations, and different assumptions about how the ocean and atmosphere interact. These models don't share the same biases. When they agree with each other, and with CFSV2, the convergence is not a single model's quirk amplified across runs. It is independent physics-based systems arriving at the same conclusion from different starting points. And right now, the NMME ensemble mean is tracking closely with the CFSV2 central estimate. There is a concept in climate science called the signal-to-noise ratio in a forecast, and it describes exactly what it sounds like. The degree to which the predictable component of the future climate state stands out above the background noise of natural variability. During the spring predictability barrier, the noise is typically high, and the signal is typically low, which is why forecasts made during this window have poor skill historically. What makes the current situation anomalous is not just that the models are agreeing, but that the agreement is emerging at a time when noise should be dominating. The fact that a clear signal is breaking through the noise during the period when noise should be winning suggests that the signal is unusually strong, not certain, not guaranteed, but unusually strong. And that strength, that persistence through a window that normally washes out weak signals, points back to the subsurface, to the place where the energy for this event is already stored, already waiting, already in motion. The current Niño 3.4 anomaly is negative 0.16 degrees Celsius. The model's central estimate for peak anomaly is around positive 2.1 to 2.2. That means we are looking at a potential warming of more than 2 degrees Celsius in a single ocean region over roughly 6 to 8 months. In a system where tenth of a degree differences drive significant global climate impacts, a 2-degree acceleration in the Central Pacific is not a rounding error, it is a reorganization. And the energy to drive that reorganization is already in the water. It just hasn't surfaced yet. Which brings us to the part of this story that almost no one is talking about. Part 3. The ocean already broke first. What you see on the surface of the Pacific Ocean right now is a neutral ocean. What's underneath it is something else entirely. This is one of those cases where the surface appearance of a thing is almost the opposite of its actual condition, like a frozen lake that looks solid and safe until you step on it and hear the crack beneath your feet. The Oceanic Niño Index, the number that shows up in news headlines when someone bothers to cover this topic, is a surface measurement. It tells you what the top layer of the Pacific is doing. It does not tell you what is happening 100 meters down or 200 meters down in the warm water reservoir that climate scientists call the subsurface heat content of the Western Pacific. And right now, what is happening down there is the key to understanding why the surface models are forecasting what they're forecasting. The Western Pacific warm pool, the region of ocean roughly east of the Philippines and northeast of Australia, is one of the warmest bodies of open ocean water on Earth. Under normal conditions, sea surface temperatures in this region run between 29 and 30 degrees Celsius. That sounds like a sauna because it more or less is, but the warmth is not just at the surface. In a La Niña state, which is the opposite phase of El Niño, cooler than average Central Pacific, stronger than normal trade winds, enhanced rainfall over the western Pacific, the trade winds essentially act as a pump, pushing warm surface water westward and causing it to pile up in the western Pacific. The warm water accumulates, deepens, and gets stored in the subsurface like a giant thermal battery. The ocean doesn't lose that heat to the atmosphere easily because once warm water sinks below the surface mixed layer, it is insulated from the atmosphere above. It just sits there, waiting. The early months of 2026 have shown sea surface temperatures in the western Pacific warm pool running between approximately 29 and 30 degrees Celsius, which is at or near the thermodynamic ceiling of tropical ocean surface temperatures, the point at which evaporative cooling and long-wave radiation roughly balance the incoming solar heating that drives the warming in the first place. But the more important measurement is what the Argo floats and the TAO/Triton mooring array, the network of ocean sensors that provides real-time subsurface data across the tropical Pacific, are showing at depth. Subsurface temperature anomalies in the western and central Pacific are positive, significantly positive. The warm water is there, and it is not sitting still. What happens next in an El Niño event is driven by something called equatorial Kelvin waves. A Kelvin wave, in this context, is not a dramatic crashing breaker on a beach. It is a slow, enormous disturbance in the thermocline, the layer of ocean where temperature drops sharply with depth, that propagates eastward along the equator at roughly 2 to 3 meters per second. When the trade winds weaken, or when they reverse temporarily, they essentially release the warm water that has been piling up in the western Pacific. That warm water doesn't immediately appear at the surface. Instead, it moves eastward as a Kelvin wave, depressing the thermocline as it goes, causing the layer of warm surface water to thicken progressively as it propagates toward the central and eastern Pacific. When those waves arrive in the eastern Pacific off the coast of Peru and Ecuador, they cause the thermocline there to deepen and the sea surface to warm. That warming is the surface expression of El Niño. But the heat was already there, in the subsurface, weeks to months before the surface showed anything anomalous. Think of it this way. El Niño is not the build-up. El Niño is the release. The pressure builds for months or years in the western Pacific while La Niña-like conditions pump warm water westward. And then, when the trade winds weaken and the system tips over, all of that stored energy begins its eastward journey toward the surface. By the time you see the Niño 3.4 index crossing positive 0.5 degrees and someone on the television announces that El Niño has officially begun, the decision was essentially made months earlier in the subsurface, in the heat content of the water column, in the physics of Kelvin waves already in transit. This is why the current forecast convergence is more credible than a surface-only analysis would suggest. The models are not predicting a Super El Niño from nothing. They are predicting a Super El Niño because they are initialized with real, subsurface ocean conditions, and those conditions are telling them that the thermal energy for a large event is already present and beginning to move. The atmosphere doesn't know yet. The surface ocean barely shows it yet. But the subsurface heat content is already leaning strongly toward an anomalous warming event, and the models are reading that lean and projecting where it leads. Now, I want to acknowledge the genuine uncertainty here because intellectual honesty demands it. Not all subsurface heat anomalies produce extreme surface warming events. The relationship between subsurface heat content and eventual El Niño magnitude is real, but not deterministic. There are cases in the observational record, notably in 1990 and 2014, where the ocean appeared primed for a major El Niño based on subsurface indicators, only for the event to fail to fully develop or to develop less intensely than the initial conditions implied. In those cases, persistent atmospheric patterns, particularly the trade winds refusing to weaken on the timescale, needed to allow the Kelvin waves to do their work, effectively suppressed the surface warming. The atmosphere can resist the ocean's push, at least temporarily. But here is what distinguishes the current setup from those false starts: the timing and the depth of the subsurface anomaly. The subsurface heat content in the Western Pacific right now is not just marginally positive, it is substantially above the threshold that historically precedes major events. And the timing of that anomaly, present and measurable at a point when the spring predictability barrier is simultaneously producing the lowest atmospheric noise of the modelling season, means the signal the models are detecting is anchored in ocean physics that is less susceptible to atmospheric noise than a purely surface-driven forecast would be. The ocean doesn't care about the spring predictability barrier. The Kelvin waves are already in motion. The heat content is already positive. The models are looking at the physical state of the ocean and saying, this is where the energy comes from. This is what the surface will do when it arrives. So the question shifts from whether there is enough energy to drive a Super El Niño to whether the atmospheric coupling will allow that energy to express itself fully at the surface. And that question, the coupling question, the atmosphere versus ocean question, is not one the models can resolve with certainty right now. But it is one where the balance of evidence is increasingly tilted toward yes. What determines whether this event becomes historic, though, is not just the Pacific. That's the part the forecast models are mostly capturing. What determines whether this becomes the kind of event that reorganizes the global climate for a season or two, versus the kind of event that gets attributed decades later by peer-reviewed science to the deaths of tens of millions of people, is what the other two oceans are doing at the same time. And that is where this conversation gets genuinely different from any standard El Niño discussion you have heard before. Part 4. The Triple Basin Alignment. Singh et al. 2018 is not a famous paper. It is not the kind of scientific finding that gets synthesized into TED Talks or turned into documentary segments. It was published in the Journal of Climate, a rigorous peer-reviewed publication that is read primarily by climate scientists and atmospheric researchers, and almost no one else. Its title is something along the lines of a technical characterization of the climate forcings associated with the 1876-78 global drought, the kind of title that makes most human beings' eyes glaze over before they finish reading it. But what it found is, by any serious measure, one of the most important pieces of attribution science produced in the last decade, and its central finding is this. El Niño did not kill 50 million people in 1877, not alone, not by itself. El Niño was the headline, but the mechanism, the specific physical configuration that turned a climate event into a global catastrophe, required 3 ocean basins acting in a synchronized pattern that amplified each region's drought signal into something no single basin could have produced on its own. Let me explain what that means, because the distinction is critical to understanding why the current ocean state is concerning in a way that a straightforward El Niño forecast is not. The Pacific component is the one everyone knows. El Niño in the central and eastern Pacific suppresses rainfall across a broad swathe of the tropics and subtropics, including South and Southeast Asia, Australia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of the Americas. It does this through a mechanism called the Walker circulation, a large-scale atmospheric circulation pattern that normally brings moisture-laden air westward across the Pacific, rising over the warm pool, generating rainfall and returning eastward at upper levels. When El Niño warms the central Pacific, the warmest water shifts east. The rising branch of the Walker circulation shifts with it, and the regions that normally benefit from that rising moist air are left in the subsidence zone, the area where the circulation descends, suppressing rainfall. That's the Pacific piece. It is real, well-documented, and dangerous enough on its own. But the Pacific piece alone does not explain 1877. The Pacific El Niño of 1876-78 was strong, but by modern estimates probably not dramatically stronger than the 1997-98 event. What made it globally catastrophic was not the Pacific alone. The second component in the Singh et al. Attribution is the Indian Ocean Dipole. The Indian Ocean Dipole, or EOD, is a mode of climate variability in the Indian Ocean that works somewhat analogously to El Niño in the Pacific. In its positive phase, meaning the Western Indian Ocean is anomalously warm relative to the Eastern Indian Ocean, it significantly alters the behaviour of the South Asian monsoon. The monsoon is the lifeblood of agricultural systems across India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and much of Southeast Asia. It delivers the overwhelming majority of annual rainfall to a region that feeds roughly 2 billion people. In a positive IOD state, the atmospheric circulation over the Indian Ocean reorganizes in a way that weakens the moisture flow into the Indian subcontinent, reducing monsoon rainfall and increasing drought risk across South Asia during the June to September monsoon season. A positive IOD occurring simultaneously with a strong El Niño does not just add their individual drought impacts together. The atmospheric teleconnections, the large-scale patterns by which ocean temperature anomalies influence atmospheric circulation far from the ocean itself, interact with each other and in some configurations they reinforce each other in a way that produces droughts more severe than either could produce alone. In 1877, the Indian Ocean dipole was in a strongly positive phase. The monsoon failed catastrophically. Crop failures across India were not partial. They were nearly total across major agricultural regions, and British colonial policy ensured that the resulting famine killed people rather than the drought alone. But the physical mechanism that created the agricultural crisis was the double forcing. Pacific and Indian Ocean acting together on the same atmospheric circulation that the monsoon depends on. The third component is the North Atlantic. This is the one that gets the least attention in standard El Niño discussions, and it is the one that Singh et al. Found to be the perhaps most underappreciated amplifier. Sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic in 1877 were anomalously warm, and that warming had a measurable influence on global atmospheric circulation through a set of teleconnections that climate scientists are still working to fully characterize. The Atlantic influences the Walker circulation through a different pathway than the Indian Ocean. It alters the distribution of moisture in the upper troposphere, modifies the position of the subtropical jet streams, and changes the large-scale pressure patterns that govern where rainfall does and does not go across Africa, South America, and the Americas. In isolation, the Atlantic warming of 1877 would not have been enough to produce catastrophic drought. But combined with a strong Pacific El Niño and a positive Indian Ocean dipole, it functioned as a third reinforcing force, an additional finger on the scale of an already precarious global moisture balance. The result of all three acting together was something that tree ring reconstructions and paleoclimate proxy records describe as the worst drought in at least 800 years, possibly longer. The failure of monsoons across Asia, the simultaneous collapse of rainfall across sub-Saharan Africa and Brazil, the synchronized crop failures across multiple continents that share no borders and no supply chains in the modern sense but that share a climate system, all of it traces back to this triple alignment of ocean basins, creating a globally coherent drought pattern that no single basin could have generated. Now let's talk about 2026, because this is where the central question of this entire discussion lives, and I'm not going to bury it in qualifications. The Pacific is warming, the models are projecting a Super El Niño. That part of the alignment is in active development. The Indian Ocean is trending toward a positive EOD phase. The current sea surface temperature patterns in the Indian Ocean, specifically the differential between the Western and Eastern Indian Ocean, are showing early positive IOD structure. This does not mean the IOD has fully committed to a strongly positive phase. It means the ocean state is moving in that direction, and the seasonal evolution of the IOD is such that its peak typically occurs in the Northern Hemisphere autumn, exactly when El Niño is also approaching its peak. If both systems peak simultaneously, their teleconnections over South Asia and Africa would be adding rather than cancelling. The North Atlantic is anomalously warm. This is not a forecast, it is a current observation. North Atlantic sea surface temperatures have been running at historically elevated levels for the past 2 years. The reasons for that warmth are actively debated in the scientific community. Some researchers point to reduced aerosol emissions from shipping fuel regulations, others to long-term ocean heat content accumulation, others to natural variability. The debate about cause matters less for our purposes than the observable fact of condition. The North Atlantic is warm, it has been warm, and the evidence does not suggest it is about to cool dramatically in the near term. So, Pacific warming trajectory pointing towards Super El Niño, Indian Ocean, trending positive IOD North Atlantic already anomalously warm. This is not the full alignment. The IOD has not committed. The magnitudes are uncertain. The atmospheric coupling between basins is complex and not deterministically predictable. There are multiple ways the configuration could fail to fully replicate the 1877 setup. But the directional trend across all three basins is simultaneously pointing in the direction that Singh et al. Identified as the mechanism behind the worst climate catastrophe in the modern record. The mainstream conversation about the current El Niño forecast is almost entirely Pacific-centric. It asks, how strong will it be? When will it peak? Which regions will get drought and which will get flooding? These are legitimate and important questions, but they are missing the question that the science of 1877 makes unavoidable. The question is not just whether we get a Super El Niño in the Pacific. The question is whether we get a Super El Niño in the Pacific, while the Indian Ocean simultaneously amplifies the monsoon failure and the North Atlantic simultaneously adds its weight to the global circulation disruption. Because that compound configuration, that teleconnection stacking, as some researchers have begun to call it, is not just the sum of 3 climate events. It is something qualitatively different from any one of them. It is what turns a climate anomaly into a system-level disruption. The event itself is uncertain. The individual basin signals are uncertain. The coupling between them is uncertain. But the configuration that science has explicitly identified as the mechanism behind 50 million deaths is beginning to assemble. And the forecast that most people are watching, the one about whether El Niño is coming and how big it might be, is only telling you about one of the 3 instruments in that ensemble. The other 2 are already tuning up. Part 5. The 1877 event reconstructed. There is a way to talk about historical climate catastrophes that makes them feel distant, abstract disasters that befell people who lived in a different technological epoch, whose deaths can be understood as the predictable consequence of pre-modern vulnerability, tragic but somehow separate from anything we need to worry about today. That framing is comfortable. It is also, in this case, wrong. The 1876-78 event, sometimes called the Great Drought, or the Victorian Great Famine, or referenced through the lens of specific regional disasters like the Grande Seca in Brazil or the simultaneous famines across India and China, was not a regional event dressed up in global language. It was a genuinely global climatic disruption that affected every inhabited continent simultaneously. And that simultaneity is the specific feature that made it catastrophic in a way that no single regional drought, however severe, could replicate. To understand the scale, you have to start with the monsoon. In 1876, the South Asian monsoon, the seasonal rainfall system that brings approximately 80% of India's annual precipitation between June and September, effectively collapsed across large portions of the subcontinent. Not weakened, not underperformed, collapsed. Rainfall in some regions was less than 25% of normal. The failure extended across not just one season but 2 consecutive years, with 1877 repeating the drought that 1876 had begun. Across a subcontinent with a population of roughly 250 to 300 million people, the majority of whom were subsistence farmers entirely dependent on that rainfall for their food supply, 2 consecutive failed monsoons was not a stress on the agricultural system. It was the destruction of it. Simultaneously, and the word simultaneously is doing enormous work in this sentence, so I want you to hold it. The rainfall systems across China's Shanxi, Shaanxi, Henan, and Shandong provinces failed. The Yellow River Basin, which has been the agricultural heartland of one of the world's most densely populated regions for thousands of years, experienced drought conditions of severity that tree-ring records suggest had not occurred in at least 3 to 4 centuries. The death toll in China alone from the 1876 to 79 period, sometimes called the Incredible Famine, or Ding Wuqi, has been estimated by historians at between 9 and 13 million people. That estimate alone is larger than the total military deaths of the United Kingdom in the entire Second World War. And that was still only part of it. Across sub-Saharan Africa, rainfall systems that multiple communities and agricultural systems depended on failed across the same 1876 to 78 window. Brazil's Nordeste region, the semi-arid interior of northeastern Brazil known as the Sertão, experienced what became known as the Grande Seca, the Great Drought, a 3-year rainfall failure so severe that it killed an estimated 500,000 people in a region whose total population was only a few million, and triggered mass migrations toward the coast that reshaped the human geography of Brazil for generations. In southern Africa, in the Deccan Plateau of India, in the coastal regions of East Africa, the same story repeated with regional variations: rainfall failures, crop losses, hunger, and death. The global simultaneity of all of these events is what the paleoclimate record confirms. Tree ring studies, which provide annual resolution records of drought and moisture going back centuries by measuring the width of growth rings in long-lived trees, have been assembled from sites across Asia, the Americas, Africa, and Australia, and they consistently show the 1876 to 78 period as one of the most globally coherent drought events in at least 800 years of reconstruction. Not the most severe in any single region necessarily, but the most globally synchronized. the event where drought signals across the most distant and separated parts of the planet all pointed in the same direction at the same time. That synchronization is not a coincidence of bad luck across many different regional climate systems. That synchronization is, as Singh et al. Documented, the fingerprint of a specific multi-basin ocean forcing pattern that imposed a common drought signal on climate systems around the world simultaneously. The population of the world in 1876 was approximately 1.4 billion people. The death toll attributed to the climate-triggered famines of 1876 to 1879 has been estimated by historians, most prominently Mike Davis in his 2001 work on Victorian-era famines, at somewhere between 30 and 50 million people. That range is wide because the historical record in many affected regions is incomplete, because deaths from famine-related disease are difficult to separate cleanly from deaths from starvation, and because the political context of colonial administration meant that accurate record-keeping was not always a priority. But even the lower bound, 30 million, represents roughly 2% of the entire human population of the Earth at the time. The upper bound, 50 million, approaches 3.5%. In absolute terms, no single event in recorded human history comes close to those numbers outside of the global wars of the 20th century. And this is where the central thread of everything we're discussing pulls tight. Those numbers were not produced by an El Niño of unusual meteorological severity. They were produced by the specific multi-basin alignment, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and the North Atlantic acting together, forcing simultaneous drought across every major agricultural system on the planet at the same time. The climate event created the physical conditions for failure. The synchronization across basins ensured that there was no unaffected breadbasket elsewhere in the world to compensate. And the human systems layered on top, the governance structures, the colonial policies, the trade networks, determined who survived and who did not. That last point is not just historical context. It is the most important thing to understand about what the current forecast configuration would mean if it verified, and we're going to get there, but first, the mechanism. Because the question of why 50 million people died is not just a historical question, it is the question that tells you what to watch for now. Part 6. Why 50 million died. The uncomfortable truth about the 1876 to 78 famines is that the climate made them possible, but the human systems made them lethal. This is not a comfortable argument, and it is not one that lets anyone off the hook, either the climate or the institutions that managed its consequences. But it is the argument that the best historical and economic scholarship on this period has converged on, and understanding it is essential to grasping why the risk calculus for a modern analogue is so different from simply rescaling the 1877 death toll to today's population. Mike Davis, in his exhaustive examination of the Victorian famines, coined the term late Victorian holocausts to describe the events of this period, and the word holocausts was deliberate. His argument was that the scale of death achieved in 1876 to 79 was not simply the result of drought. It was the result of a specific economic and political system, British colonial administration in India, and in various forms across Africa and Asia, that made populations maximally vulnerable to climate stress and then failed catastrophically to mitigate it. Consider the specific mechanism in British India. The British colonial government, operating under the economic orthodoxy of the time, a form of laissez-faire market theory that held that government intervention in food markets was economically counterproductive and morally corrosive, maintained the export of grain from India throughout the famine. This is the detail that historians return to again and again, because it encapsulates the policy logic of the period. While millions of Indians were dying of starvation, grain continued to flow out of Indian ports to British and international markets because the market price in those export markets was higher than the purchasing power of starving subsistence farmers in the interior. The grain was physically present in India. The market mechanism dictated that it would not stay there. The railroad network, which the British had built across India in the decades preceding the famine, partly for strategic military purposes and partly to facilitate resource extraction, functioned during the famine not as a distribution network for relief, not primarily anyway, but as a mechanism for price arbitration. Grain dealers used the railroad to move food toward higher-priced urban and coastal markets, which in practice meant moving it away from the famine zones where subsistence farmers had no purchasing power. The railroad, in this context, accelerated the extraction of food from the regions that needed it most, toward markets that could pay more for it. British famine relief policy, where it existed at all, was often designed to minimize cost and avoid creating what administrators described as dependency. Relief camps were established but deliberately understaffed and undersupplied. Food rations in some camps were calculated at levels below those available to inmates in Auschwitz, as Davis notes with deliberate harshness. The political will to intervene at a scale commensurate with the human crisis was absent, partly because the ideological framework of the time made mass death by market forces seem more acceptable, or at least more philosophically consistent, than the alternative of market intervention. The situation in Qing China was structurally similar, though politically distinct. The Qing dynasty, already weakened by decades of internal conflict and external pressure, lacked the administrative capacity and fiscal resources to respond to the scale of the drought across the northern provinces. The traditional famine relief systems that had functioned, however imperfectly, in earlier centuries had been disrupted by the upheavals of the mid-19th century, including the Taiping Rebellion. The crisis hit an already weakened state apparatus, and the outcome was predictable. Why does any of this matter for 2026? Because the Singh et al. Paper makes something explicit that purely climate-focused discussions leave implicit. The 50 million dead were not killed by the climate event alone. They were killed by the combination of a climate event that created synchronized global stress and human systems that were not designed, or were actively designed not, to manage that stress equitably. The climate created the pressure. The institutions determined whether that pressure was absorbed or passed through to the most vulnerable populations. The modern global system has different institutions. It has food aid organizations, international commodity markets, early warning systems, and national governments with varying but generally greater capacity for response than Victorian-era colonial administrations. These systems genuinely matter, and they genuinely reduce the risk of mortality at Victorian-era scales. A direct repeat of 1877 is not what a verified triple basin alignment would produce in 2026, and I want to be clear and honest about that. But the more important question for today is not whether modern institutions can prevent a repeat of the mortality rate of 1877. The more important question is whether modern institutions, including global food supply chains that have become extraordinarily interconnected, commodity markets that transmit price shocks globally within hours, and political systems that face domestic pressure when food prices rise, can manage the stress of a synchronized global drought signal without themselves introducing new and different failure modes. And that question does not have the same comfortable answer. The Victorian system failed under the stress of 1877 in ways that were characteristic of Victorian systems: colonial extraction, market orthodoxy, institutional rigidity, and the deliberate exclusion of human welfare from the optimization function of governance. A modern system would not fail in those ways, but it might fail in other ways, and the stress test the Singh et al. Configuration represents is not a test that any modern institution has been subjected to at full magnitude since the system was built. We'll come back to what that test looks like in today's world. But first, the mechanism that most people are missing, the specific piece of the Singh et al. Analysis that is most relevant to what the data is showing right now, and why the mainstream El Niño forecast is telling you only part of the story. Part 7. The detail most people miss. The most important sentence in Singh et al. 2018 is not the one about the death toll. It is the one that says, in technical but unambiguous language, that the magnitude and global extent of the 1876-78 drought cannot be reproduced by Pacific forcing alone. That sentence is the key to understanding why everything about the current forecast situation requires a different framing than the standard El Niño analysis. Because if that sentence is right, and the paper presents substantial evidence that it is, then focusing exclusively on the Pacific component of the current forecast, as almost all mainstream discussion does, is not just incomplete, it is missing the mechanism, it is measuring the fuse and ignoring the powder. Let me explain the Indian Ocean dipole mechanism more precisely, because the level of detail matters here. The IOD is not simply a warm patch in the Western Indian Ocean. It is a coupled ocean-atmosphere phenomenon, meaning the ocean and the atmosphere reinforce each other's anomalies through a feedback loop. When the Western Indian Ocean becomes anomalously warm relative to the Eastern Indian Ocean, the atmospheric circulation responds by developing an anomalous pattern of winds and moisture transport over the Indian Ocean. Those winds, in turn, help maintain the sea surface temperature gradient that caused them. The result is a self-reinforcing state that, once established, tends to persist through the Northern Hemisphere autumn. The atmospheric impact of a positive IOD on the South Asian monsoon operates through a mechanism called the anomalous Walker circulation over the Indian Ocean. Under normal conditions, the monsoon is maintained by a circulation that brings moisture from the ocean into the Indian subcontinent and drives the deep convection, the towering thunderstorms that produce the bulk of South Asian rainfall. In a positive IOD state, the anomalous atmospheric circulation over the Indian Ocean disrupts that moisture transport, weakening the low-level winds that carry moisture on shore and strengthening the conditions that suppress deep convection over the Indian subcontinent. The result is reduced monsoon rainfall, sometimes dramatically reduced, depending on the magnitude of the IOD. Now add the Pacific El Niño signal. El Niño independently suppresses the Indian monsoon through a different but related mechanism. It alters the Walker circulation over the Pacific in a way that changes the large-scale pressure patterns over Asia, which also tends to weaken the monsoon. Both the IOD and El Niño push the monsoon in the same direction, toward reduced rainfall but through partially independent physical pathways. When both are present simultaneously, and both are pushing in the same direction, their effects are not simply additive. The large-scale atmospheric circulation patterns they modify, the Walker circulation, the subtropical ridges, the placement of pressure systems over the Indian subcontinent interact with each other, and in the specific configuration of a strong positive IOD coinciding with a strong Pacific El Niño, the resulting atmospheric state is one that is qualitatively different from either signal alone. Climate scientists sometimes use the term teleconnection stacking to describe this phenomenon. When multiple ocean-based forcing signals stack their atmospheric responses in the same direction over the same region, the resulting climate anomaly can be disproportionately large relative to what any single forcing would produce. The Atlantic influence operates through yet a third mechanism, and it is the one that requires the most careful description because it is the most indirect. North Atlantic sea surface temperatures influence global atmospheric circulation through their effect on the position of the Atlantic Intertropical Convergence Zone, the ITCZ, which is the band of intense rainfall and convection that migrates seasonally across the equatorial Atlantic. When the North Atlantic is anomalously warm, the ITCZ tends to shift northward, which alters the large-scale moisture transport patterns across South America and Africa. It also influences the Walker circulation over the Atlantic basin, which is connected to the Walker circulation over the Pacific through the global continuity of the atmosphere. Anomalous warmth in the North Atlantic effectively adds a third forcing to a Walker circulation that is already being distorted by the Pacific El Niño and the Indian Ocean dipole. The resulting global atmospheric circulation state is one in which the moisture-bearing systems that normally sustain agriculture across multiple continents are simultaneously displaced, weakened, or suppressed. This is the compound climate event framework, and it represents one of the most important developments in climate science over the last decade. Traditional climate risk assessment tends to evaluate hazards one at a time. What is the probability of a strong El Niño? What is the probability of a positive IOD? What is the probability of anomalous North Atlantic warmth? And then it treats these as independent risks to be summed. But the Singh et al. Analysis, consistent with a growing body of compound event research, shows that these hazards are not independent. They can co-occur, they can reinforce each other, and when they do, the resulting impact is not the sum of their individual effects but something larger, something that is specifically what happened in 1877. Here is the aspect of the current situation that should receive more attention than it currently does. Modern climate datasets and modelling systems are, for the first time in history, capable of detecting the early formation of a triple basin alignment in near real time. In 1877, there was no global observational network. There were no Argo floats, no satellite sea surface temperature measurements, no TOW mooring arrays transmitting subsurface data in real time. There was no way to detect the Indian Ocean dipole developing, or the North Atlantic warming, or the subsurface Kelvin waves moving eastward in the Pacific in time to do anything about it. The configuration simply assembled itself and expressed its full impact before any human system could anticipate it. We have the tools now, we have the data, we have the models and the attribution science. What we currently lack is the mainstream scientific communication infrastructure that translates a multi-basin compound event analysis, the specific kind of analysis that Sky Lab represents, into the public forecast conversation in a way that is commensurate with its importance. The standard El Niño forecast products that the public receives are Pacific-focused, because that is what ENSO monitoring is designed to track. The Indian Ocean Dipole gets its own forecast products, but they receive a small fraction of the public attention given to El Niño forecasts. The North Atlantic SST situation is discussed in the context of hurricane season forecasting, but rarely in the context of its interaction with other basin-scale climate signals. The result is a situation where the most potentially important aspect of the current climate forecast, not the Pacific El Niño alone, but the potential assembly of the specific multi-basin configuration that Sky Lab identified, is essentially invisible in the mainstream forecast conversation. The configuration may not fully materialize. The IOD may not commit to a strongly positive phase. The Atlantic may not couple to the Pacific El Niño in the specific way the 1877 record shows. All of those outcomes are possible, and some are perhaps even probable. But the possibility that the assembly is happening right now, in real time, detectable in the data for the first time in history precisely because we have the observational systems that 1877 lacked, that possibility deserves a more prominent place in the conversation than it is currently receiving. And if that configuration does fully materialize, the question is not whether the world will look like 1877. It is whether the world of 2026, with all of its modern systems and capabilities and vulnerabilities, is prepared for the kind of stress test that the Sky alignment represents. Because the modern world is not the Victorian world, but it is not immune to synchronized global climate disruption. It is simply vulnerable to it in different, and in some ways more complex ways. Part 8. The baseline has shifted. Here is something that is easy to say but harder to fully grasp. Every El Niño that occurs from this point forward in human history will occur in a different climate than every El Niño that occurred before roughly 2015. Not a slightly different climate, not a marginally warmer background state, a measurably, physically distinct climate system in which the baseline sea surface temperatures, the atmospheric moisture content, the land surface conditions, and the thermodynamic limits on extreme events are all shifted relative to the pre-industrial reference state that climate scientists use to define anomalies. The current global mean surface temperature is running approximately 1.2 to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial baseline, above the average that existed before large-scale fossil fuel burning began altering the composition of the atmosphere. That number sounds small, the same way positive 2.1 degrees Celsius in the Niño 3.4 index sounds small. And in the same way that the Niño index number stops sounding small once you understand what it means for global atmospheric circulation, the global warming baseline stops sounding small once you understand what it means for the behavior of climate events operating on top of it. Start with the most basic thermodynamic implication. The atmosphere holds water vapor, the fuel for rainfall and storms, according to a relationship governed by the Clausius-Clapeyron equation, which says that for every 1 degree Celsius of warming, the atmosphere can hold approximately 7% more water vapor. 7% more water vapor means 7% more fuel available for precipitation events. It means heavier rainfall where rain is expected. But, and this is the piece that matters enormously for drought risk, it does not mean more rainfall everywhere. The additional water vapor in the atmosphere intensifies the wet regions and the dry regions simultaneously. Wet areas tend to get wetter, dry areas tend to get drier. The contrast between the rainfall-suppressed regions and the rainfall-enhanced regions, which is exactly what an El Niño event creates through its influence on global atmospheric circulation, is amplified by the additional moisture capacity of a warmer atmosphere. In concrete terms, this means that a Super El Niño occurring in 2026 would impose a drought signal on the same regions that a Super El Niño would have affected in 1877, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, northeastern Brazil, but it would do so on a background climate state where the thermodynamic potential for extreme dryness is higher than it was in the Victorian era. The soil moisture deficits that develop during El Niño droughts are deeper when they start from an already stressed soil moisture baseline. The heat waves that accompany El Niño-related drought, because reduced evaporative cooling on dry land allows temperatures to spike, are more intense when superimposed on a warmer mean temperature. The feedback loops that sustain and amplify drought conditions, dry soil, reduced evaporation, suppressed rainfall, further soil drying are more easily triggered and harder to break in a warmer climate. There is a concept in climate science called loading the dice. It describes the way that anthropogenic warming doesn't make specific extreme events certain, but shifts the probability distribution of outcomes in a way that makes extreme events more likely and less extreme events less likely. An unloaded die might show double sixes, meaning an extreme event roughly 3% of the time. A loaded die might show double sixes 10% or 15% of the time. You still can't predict any individual roll, but the frequency and intensity of the extreme outcomes increases systematically. The climate system is now playing with loaded dice in a way that it was not in 1877. The same atmospheric forcing, the same multi-basin ocean configuration, will produce more intense surface climate anomalies in the 2026 climate than it would have in the 1876 climate, not because the ocean forcing is necessarily stronger, but because the thermodynamic response of the atmosphere and land surface to that forcing is amplified by the higher baseline temperature. The ocean heat content globally is not just elevated at the surface. The oceans have absorbed roughly 90% of the excess heat that greenhouse gas forcing has added to the Earth system over the industrial period. That heat is distributed throughout the water column, and its presence means that the thermal energy available to drive climate extremes is larger now than it has been at any point in the instrumental record. When a Kelvin wave propagates eastward in the Pacific, it is doing so through an ocean that is warmer at depth than it was during the 1997-98 event. When that warm water surfaces in the eastern Pacific, it does so against a background of already elevated sea surface temperatures, which means the absolute temperature anomaly, not just the departure from the average, but the actual temperature of the water, is higher. Higher absolute temperatures mean more evaporation, more moisture in the atmosphere over the El Niño region, and stronger amplification of the atmospheric circulation changes that El Niño drives. This is not purely bad news in every direction. The same thermodynamic amplification that intensifies drought in the affected regions also intensifies rainfall in the El Niño-enhanced regions, the areas that tend to receive above-average rainfall during El Niño events, including parts of the southern United States, eastern Africa, and coastal South America. A warmer baseline does not unidirectionally increase suffering, but the distribution of impacts, who benefits from more rainfall and who suffers from more drought, is not equal, and the regions most at risk from the Singh et al. Multi-basin alignment are already among the most climate vulnerable on Earth. The key point for the central thread of this discussion is not that the modern climate baseline makes a 2026 event more deadly than 1877 in absolute terms. Modern agricultural productivity, global supply chains, early warning systems, and international humanitarian response capacity mean that the mortality impact of a synchronized global drought would not replicate Victorian-era mortality rates, full stop. But the same thermodynamic amplification that loads the climate dice means that the physical intensity of the climate signals produced by a verified triple basin alignment in 2026 would likely be greater than the physical signals that produced the 1877 event. The stress imposed on modern agricultural systems and food supply chains, which were built and optimized for the climate of the last century, not the climate of the next, would be correspondingly greater. And the question of whether modern systems can absorb that greater stress without cascading failures is precisely the question that no climate model can answer. Part 9. The global food system is a single machine now. In 1877, the world's food systems were not connected. That sentence requires qualification, because there were global food markets in the Victorian era. Grain from the American plains was already being exported to Britain and Europe, and colonial food flows connected India and Southeast Asia to European trading networks. But the connectivity was partial, slow, and characterized by enough redundancy and regional self-sufficiency that a crop failure in one region did not instantaneously propagate into a price crisis in another. When the Indian monsoon failed in 1876, the primary mechanism by which that failure killed Indian farmers was not the global market. It was the absence of local food reserves combined with colonial policies that prevented redistribution. The failure was local in its immediate expression, even if its climate cause was global. The 2026 global food system is categorically different. It is not a collection of regional food systems with some trade connections between them. It is a single, deeply integrated global machine, a system of production, transportation, storage, commodity trading, and distribution that operates in continuous real time across every country on Earth, and that has been optimized over decades for efficiency rather than resilience. That optimization has produced extraordinary results in terms of caloric production and distribution under normal conditions. Global food prices have trended downward in real terms for most of the last half-century. Caloric availability per capita has increased. Hundreds of millions of people who would have faced food insecurity under pre-modern agricultural productivity now have consistent access to adequate nutrition. These are genuine achievements of the modern food system, and they are not trivial. But the same optimization for efficiency that produced these achievements has a specific structural consequence: the removal of buffers. Buffer stocks, the grain reserves, the storage capacity, the slack in supply chains that allows a system to absorb a shock in one part without propagating that shock throughout, have been systematically reduced as modern supply chain management has moved toward just-in-time models. Just-in-time delivery, in which food moves through the supply chain in close synchrony with demand rather than being stored at multiple nodes, is maximally efficient under stable conditions and maximally fragile under disruption. When the stable conditions assumption breaks down, when a major production region fails to deliver its expected output, there is less buffer in the system to absorb the gap, and price signals propagate faster and more sharply to other parts of the system. Walk through what the current forecast configuration would mean for the global food system if it verified, because the scenario is specific enough to be worth tracing in detail. India is the world's largest exporter of rice and one of the major exporters of wheat. A significantly failed South Asian monsoon in the summer of 2026, the kind that a coincident strong Pacific El Niño and positive Indian Ocean dipole would be expected to produce based on historical precedent, would reduce Indian agricultural output across a range of staple crops. India's response, historically and by current policy precedent, would include export restrictions, bans or tariffs on rice and wheat exports designed to protect domestic food availability. India has done this repeatedly in recent years, including during price spikes in 2022 and 2023. The announcement of Indian export restrictions sends an immediate price signal through global commodity markets, because India is large enough in global rice markets that its absence as a supplier creates a real supply deficit that other producers cannot quickly fill. Simultaneously, if the same multi-basin configuration produces below normal rainfall in sub-Saharan Africa and northeastern Brazil, which historical teleconnection patterns and the Singh et al. Attribution suggest it would, the global production of multiple staple crops would be simultaneously reduced in several of the world's major growing regions. The global commodity markets would be absorbing reduced supply signals from multiple major production zones at the same time, rather than sequentially. The difference between sequential shocks and simultaneous shocks in a tightly coupled market system is not linear. Sequential shocks allow time for adjustment, substitution, and reserve drawdown. Simultaneous shocks overwhelm these mechanisms because the adjustment options that cushion any one regional shock are themselves impaired by the other regional shocks happening at the same time. The result would be sharp, rapid, and globally synchronized food price increases. The model for what this looks like in practice is not hypothetical. We have the 2010-11 commodity price spike, driven in part by a Russian wheat export ban following a heatwave, combined with simultaneous production shortfalls in Australia and Pakistan, to show how quickly global food prices can escalate when multiple production regions are simultaneously stressed. Global wheat prices roughly doubled in a 6-month period in 2010-11. That event contributed to social instability across a wide arc of the Middle East and North Africa, and is cited by analysts as one of the background conditions that made the populations of those regions susceptible to the political disruptions of the Arab Spring. And the 2010-11 event was not a full triple basin alignment. It was a coincidence of regional climate stresses, not a globally coherent forcing pattern of the kind the Singh et al. Analysis describes. The inequality dimension of this scenario is not incidental. Modern food markets have a specific property that the Victorian colonial food system also had, though through different mechanisms. The shock is transmitted globally, but its effects are not equally distributed globally. High-income countries have the purchasing power to outcompete lower-income countries for available food supplies when prices spike, just as Victorian British merchants outcompeted Indian subsistence farmers for available grain when colonial markets were open. A global food price spike driven by a synchronized El Niño drought event does not threaten the food security of populations in Western Europe or North America in the same way it threatens the food security of populations in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and parts of the Middle East. Populations that already spend a larger share of their income on food have less buffer purchasing power and have less institutional capacity to absorb the economic shock through government subsidies or social safety nets. The modern system prevents Victorian-style mass mortality, but it distributes the economic pain of a synchronized climate shock in ways that are not uniform, and the populations that bear the greatest burden are precisely the populations that Singh et al.'s historical analysis identified as the most devastated in 1877. The geography of vulnerability has not changed as much as the nature of the system has. And here's the thing about a just-in-time global food machine. It is a machine. Machines are predictable under the conditions they were designed for and unpredictable under the conditions they were not. The global food supply chain was designed for a climate that is no longer fully operative. It has not been stress-tested against a verified triple basin alignment. Nobody alive has seen one. The early signals that such a test might be approaching are already beginning to appear in the data, though they're easy to misread as routine anomalies rather than the first whispers of a pattern beginning to assemble. Part 10. Climate Teleconnections, already starting to echo. The atmosphere is not a patient system. When the Pacific warms, the effects do not politely wait for the ocean to reach its peak before beginning to reorganize the global circulation. The atmospheric response to ENSO forcing begins as soon as the sea surface temperature anomalies are large enough to alter the patterns of convection and moisture transport that drive global weather systems. In the early months of 2026, even before the Pacific has crossed the official El Niño threshold, the first early-stage atmospheric responses consistent with an evolving warm event are already visible in the record. Tropical Pacific typhoon activity in early 2026 has shown patterns that climate scientists recognize as consistent with a warming trend in the central and eastern Pacific, specifically a tendency for typhoon formation to shift eastward relative to its climatological position, and for storm intensification rates to increase, consistent with the higher sea surface temperatures and increased atmospheric moisture content that accompanies a developing warm event. Western Pacific marine heat waves, patches of anomalously warm ocean surface that have become more frequent and more intense as background warming has raised the baseline, have been more persistent in early 2026 than the climatological record would suggest is typical for this phase of the ENSO cycle. In the Atlantic, the mechanism by which El Niño suppresses hurricane activity, through increased wind shear in the tropical Atlantic which disrupts the vertical structure of developing tropical cyclones, is beginning to emerge in model forecasts for the coming hurricane season. This is the kind of teleconnection that is expected and well documented. Its appearance in the forecast products now is consistent with the model's view of a developing Pacific warm event, beginning to project its influence on the Atlantic circulation. These are early echoes, first-order atmospheric responses to an ocean forcing that is still in its formative stage, visible to the instruments but not yet dramatic enough to register as unusual to anyone not specifically looking for them. The significance of these early signals for our central question is not in their individual magnitude but in their directionality. They are pointing the same way the ocean is pointing. The atmosphere is beginning to respond to a Pacific warming signal that, according to the subsurface data, is only going to amplify over the coming months. And the pattern of those early responses is broadly consistent with what climate models project as the initial atmospheric expression of the kind of large El Niño event the models are forecasting. The atmosphere is starting to lean in the same direction as the ocean. The story is beginning to tell itself. Part 11. The Silent Amplifiers. Somewhere beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, a river the size of no river on Earth's surface is slowing down. The Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, AMOC, is the large-scale ocean circulation system that transports warm surface water northward from the tropics to the North Atlantic, releases heat to the atmosphere, cools and sinks, and returns southward as cold deep water. It is the engine behind Western Europe's disproportionately mild climate. the mechanism that makes London warmer in winter than it has any right to be at its latitude, and a critical regulator of how heat is distributed between the tropics and the poles. And there is a body of emerging research, still contested, still uncertain in its magnitude and timeline, but consistent enough across multiple methodologies to warrant serious attention, suggesting that AMOC has been weakening over the course of the industrial period, and that it may be approaching a condition of reduced stability. The specific interaction between AMOC weakening and ENSO dynamics is not well characterized in the scientific literature. The mechanisms are speculative, the magnitude of any interaction is uncertain, and there is no scientific consensus on how a weakened AMOC would modify the behavior of a strong El Niño event, or the Indian Ocean dipole, or the North Atlantic sea surface temperatures that Singh et al. Identified as the third component of the 1877 alignment. What is clear is that the North Atlantic SST anomalies that have been present for the last 2 years, the anomalous warmth that represents one component of the Singh et al. 3-part alignment, may themselves be connected to changes in AMOC, because AMOC is a primary mechanism for distributing heat within the Atlantic basin. If the circulation that normally moves heat from one part of the basin to another is operating differently than it has historically, the SST patterns in the North Atlantic may reflect that change, and the atmospheric teleconnections from those SST patterns may be correspondingly modified. This is genuinely uncertain science, and I'm not going to overstate it. But the possibility that the El Niño event now taking shape is occurring within a North Atlantic heat distribution system that is itself in an unusual state, and that the interaction between these two conditions could modify the outcome in ways that standard ENSO forecast products do not capture, is not a fringe hypothesis. It is a legitimate area of scientific inquiry that represents one more reason to treat the current forecast configuration with more attention than a standard El Niño forecast would typically warrant. The El Niño forming now is not forming in the same ocean system as the El Niños of the 1990s. It is forming in an ocean that is warmer, in some basins potentially reorganizing in its circulation, and in a global climate state that amplifies the thermodynamic response to any given forcing. Whether those background changes make the outcome more extreme, or whether they modify it in ways that reduce the correspondence with historical analogues like 1877, is a question the models cannot yet fully answer. But it is a question worth keeping in view as the forecast evolves over the coming months. Part 12. The Spring Predictability Barrier. Every good investigative story has a moment where you have to stop and explain why the thing you've been building toward might not actually be true. This is that moment. The spring predictability barrier is real, it is significant, and it has humbled confident ENSO forecasts before. The physical basis for it is not complicated. The tropical Pacific Ocean atmosphere coupling, the two-way feedback between ocean surface temperatures and the atmospheric winds that they drive, and that in turn drive them, goes through a seasonal minimum during boreal spring. The coupling is weakest when the solar angle in the tropics is high, when the SST gradients that drive the coupling are at their annual minimum, and when the atmosphere is in its most thermodynamically active state for the year. During this window, the signal that climate models are trying to detect, the slowly evolving ENSO state, is partially masked by atmospheric noise that is decorrelated from the ocean state. The models are trying to read a message written in pencil against a background of ink. Historically, forecasts made during the spring predictability barrier have had lower skill than forecasts made at other times of year, even when controlling for the lead time. This is not a claim about model inadequacy in general, it is a claim about a specific seasonal window when the physics of the system make prediction genuinely harder. And the track record of enthusiastic spring forecasts is not unblemished. In 2014, the Pacific developed conditions that models were confident would produce a major El Niño: strong subsurface heat content, weakening trade winds, early Kelvin wave activity. The forecast plume in early 2014 looked broadly similar to what we see in early 2026. The event failed to fully develop. The trade winds recovered, the subsurface heat was partially redistributed without producing the expected surface warming, and what emerged was a modest El Niño rather than the super event many models had projected. The 2014 near miss is the cautionary tale that every ENSO forecaster carries with them. So the spring predictability barrier is real, and the 2014 analogue is real. and both of them counsel humility about the current forecast convergence. What makes the current situation different from the typical spring barrier scenario, though, is the combination of factors I've been describing throughout this discussion. The CFSV2 and NMME are not just independently agreeing about the sign of the event, they are agreeing about the magnitude, which is a stronger constraint. The subsurface heat content is anchoring the forecast in ocean physics rather than atmospheric variability, which means the barrier's noise primarily affects the atmospheric coupling component of the forecast rather than the ocean heat content that is driving it. And the IRI forecast probability, 70% El Niño probability during the barrier, rising rapidly afterward, reflects the collective judgment of forecasters who know about the barrier and are applying it as a discount to their confidence. The probabilistic framing is critical here, and I want to push on it because it matters for how to think about what is and isn't being claimed. When the IRI says 70% El Niño probability, that means that in 30% of scenarios consistent with current observations and model output, El Niño does not develop, or develops only weakly, below the threshold for significance. When CFSV2 projects positive 2.1 degrees Celsius at peak, that is the central estimate, not the guaranteed outcome, the distribution of possible outcomes extends from neutral to Super El Niño. The uncertainty is real, genuine, and non-trivial. But here is the thing about probabilistic forecasts that is easy to lose sight of. A 30% chance of an El Niño failing to develop is not a reason to ignore the 70% chance that it does. A 30% chance that the multi-basin configuration will not fully materialize is not a reason to stop monitoring whether it is. The spring predictability barrier means we should hold the forecast with appropriate epistemic humility, update our view as new data arrives over the next 2 to 3 months, and avoid treating the central estimate as a certainty. It does not mean we should treat the signal as noise. The barrier reduces confidence, it does not invalidate the signal. The most important thing to watch over the coming months is whether the forecast skill increases as the spring predictability barrier recedes, whether the ensemble spread narrows, whether the different modelling systems continue to converge or begin to diverge, and whether the atmospheric coupling starts to confirm what the subsurface ocean conditions have been implying for months. That evolution will tell us whether we are watching a genuine signal that is clarifying as the barrier recedes, or a false alarm that is slowly collapsing under the weight of a reality that refused to match the forecast. Part 13. Known model failures. Climate models are not crystal balls. They are the distillation of the best mathematical understanding of physical systems that humanity has developed, and they are genuinely extraordinary tools, but they have known limitations, known biases, and a documented track record of specific kinds of failure that any honest discussion of the current forecast has to address. The CFSV2 has a specific tendency to overshoot El Niño peaks in its extended range forecasts. This bias is well documented in the scientific literature and in the operational evaluation of the model's forecasts against subsequent observations. The bias arises partly from the model's tendency to overestimate the rate of atmospheric ocean coupling during the development phase of El Niño. It allows the ocean warming to drive atmospheric circulation changes a bit too efficiently, which in turn feeds back into additional ocean warming through the Bjerknes feedback, producing an El Niño that grows faster and peaks higher than the real world tends to allow. Knowing this bias exists does not eliminate it from the forecast, but it does mean the experienced user should apply a downward adjustment to the CFSV2 peak estimate, perhaps on the order of 0.2 to 0.5 degrees Celsius at long lead times. The NMME is a collection of models that together tend to reduce the idiosyncratic biases of any single model, because the models that are too enthusiastic about El Niño development are averaged with the models that are less enthusiastic, and the result is a blend that tracks the real world better than any individual model at the multi-model ensemble level. But even the NMME ensemble mean has skill limitations at lead times beyond roughly 6 months during boreal spring, and the spread of the NMME ensemble, the range of outcomes its constituent models are producing, is wide enough to include scenarios ranging from strong El Niño to neutral conditions. The mean is positive 2.1. The spread includes positive 0.8 to positive 2.8. The mean is the most likely individual outcome, but the range of outcomes the models consider plausible is wide. Given these limitations, the honest range of forecast scenarios for the coming ENSO season runs something like this. The most likely outcome, the one the model's central estimates are pointing toward, is a strong to Super El Niño, peaking in the range of positive 1.5 to positive 2.2 degrees Celsius in Niño 3.4 in the northern hemisphere late autumn and early winter. This would be the first confirmed Super El Niño since 2015-16, and it would occur on a warmer global baseline than any previous super event. This scenario is consistent with the subsurface heat content observations and the independent model convergence, and I would estimate it is carrying something between 40 and 60% of the probability weight based on the current evidence, acknowledging that this is my assessment and not a formal model output. The second scenario is a strong El Niño that falls below the super threshold, a peak in the range of positive 1.2 to positive 1.8 degrees Celsius. This would be a significant event, comparable in magnitude to the 1909 to 1990 event or the 29 to 2010 event, but would not reach the magnitude associated with the multi-basin alignment risk I've been describing. Under this scenario, the Singh et al. Analog is significantly weakened because the Pacific component of the triple forcing is less intense. This scenario benefits from the CFS V2 downward bias adjustment and from the historical base rate for spring predictability barrier miss rates, and I would put it at roughly 25 to 30% of the probability weight. The third scenario is a failed or significantly weakened development, El Niño threshold barely crossed or not crossed at all, analogous to 2014. This requires the trade winds to recover and the atmospheric coupling to remain suppressed through the barrier window. It is the scenario where the 2014 analog dominates. Given the depth of the current subsurface anomaly relative to 2014, this scenario seems less likely than in most spring barrier situations, but it is not negligible, perhaps 15 to 20%. The key observational tests that will distinguish these scenarios over the next 2 to 3 months are the evolution of trade winds in the central and western Pacific, the rate of SST warming in the Niño 3.4 region as the barrier recedes, and the behavior of the subsurface heat content in the eastern Pacific as the Kelvin waves complete their transit. Those indicators, more than any model output, will tell us which scenario we are living in. Part 14. What this is not. Before we move toward the final act of this story, I want to take a deliberate pause. Not a long one, but a necessary one. Because we are now at the point in a video like this where the internet tends to do what the internet does, and if you have spent any time in the corners of YouTube or social media where climate discussion lives alongside conspiracy theory, you already know what I mean. So before we go any further, let me tell you clearly and specifically what this story is not, because clearing that table is not just a courtesy. It is a prerequisite for having an honest conversation about what the story actually is. Let's start with geoengineering, because it will come up in the comments if I don't address it here. The claim goes something like this. The anomalous warming we are seeing in the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and the North Atlantic is not natural. It is the result of deliberate atmospheric intervention, chemical spraying, aerosol injection, some form of classified weather modification technology that powerful institutions are using to manipulate the global climate for purposes that vary depending on which version of the theory you encounter. I want to engage with this seriously rather than dismissively, because the people asking these questions are often asking them because they have genuinely noticed that something unusual is happening in the climate data, and that instinct that something unusual is happening is not wrong. Something unusual is happening. The data is real, the anomalies are real, but the geoengineering explanation fails on the most basic physical grounds, and the numbers are not close. The Pacific Warm Pool, the reservoir of thermal energy in the western equatorial Pacific that is currently loaded with heat and moving eastward in subsurface Kelvin waves, contains more thermal energy than the entire human civilization has released by burning fossil fuels across the complete industrial period. Not in a recent decade, not in a particularly bad year. Across the entire history of industrialization, from the first coal-fired steam engine to every gas-powered vehicle on every road on Earth today, the total thermal output is dwarfed by the energy stored in a single major ocean heat reservoir. Any technology capable of meaningfully modifying that reservoir at the scale required to produce a Super El Niño would need to operate at a power level that would itself be the most significant energy event in human history. Visible, measurable, and impossible to conceal from the global network of ocean sensors atmospheric monitoring stations, and independent scientific institutions that exist across dozens of countries with competing national interests. The stratospheric aerosol injection schemes that serious geoengineering researchers actually study and publish about are specifically designed to reflect a small fraction of incoming solar radiation. They are not designed to heat the ocean. They do not heat the ocean. And the classified version of that technology, whatever you imagine it to be, does not exist at the energy scale this would require. If you have encountered content claiming otherwise, you have encountered science fiction wearing the costume of technical language. The costume is convincing from a distance. It does not hold up when you check the numbers. Now let's talk about the sun, because this one is more interesting and the science is more nuanced, and I say that as someone who covers solar activity on this channel and genuinely finds the sun-climate connection to be one of the more fascinating open questions in geophysics. The current solar cycle 25, is tracking toward a moderately active maximum. It is running slightly above the predictions that were made for it at the start of the cycle, which is genuinely notable and worth covering on its own terms. But slightly above an average prediction is not the same as anomalously extreme, and the global temperature effect of a solar cycle of this magnitude is on the order of 0.1 degrees Celsius over the full 11-year cycle. That is a real signal. It is measurable, it matters for precise climate attribution. But it is 1 to 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the ENSO anomalies we are discussing in this video. A 2 degrees Celsius warming in the Niño 3.4 index does not have a solar cycle explanation. The solar forcing is not large enough, is not localized to the right ocean basins, and does not produce the specific pattern of subsurface heat content increase in the Western Pacific that the Tau mooring array and Argo float network are actually observing. The solar connection to ENSO variability is a legitimate area of ongoing research. There are peer-reviewed papers exploring whether solar activity influences trade wind patterns and ENSO phase transitions through stratospheric pathways, but that research is exploratory and the effect sizes found are small. There is no credible peer-reviewed evidence that solar activity is the primary driver of the current forecast. None. And on this channel we follow the evidence even when the sun is not the answer. The third thing I want to address directly is the data suppression claim, the idea that NOAA is hiding the true forecast, or manipulating the models, or that the information I have been describing in this video is somehow being kept from the public by institutional gatekeeping. I want to be genuinely direct here. The data is public, all of it. The CFS-V2 forecast output is available on NOAA's website in real time, updated daily, downloadable by anyone with an internet connection, and the patience to navigate a government data portal. The NMME ensemble is public. The IRI forecast plumes are public. The Argo float data, the real-time subsurface ocean temperature measurements from the network of autonomous floats distributed across the global ocean are public. The Tau and Troiton mooring array data, the fixed sensors that measure subsurface conditions along the equatorial Pacific, are public. I am not working from leaked documents or insider sources. Everything I have described in this video is sitting in publicly accessible databases that anyone can query right now, today, for free. The reason the multi-basin compound event story is not prominent in mainstream climate coverage is not that someone is suppressing it. It is considerably more mundane than that, and in some ways more frustrating. The Singh et al. Finding requires synthesizing observations across 3 separate ocean basins, understanding the teleconnection mechanisms between them, and connecting that synthesis to a historical attribution study that most climate journalists have never read and that does not fit neatly into the standard format of an El Niño forecast story. Standard El Niño coverage has a clear narrative structure. The Pacific warms, here are the regions that get drought, here are the regions that get flooding, here is what it means for hurricane season. That story is simple, familiar, and can be told in 400 words. The multi-basin compound event story requires you to explain what the Indian Ocean dipole is, why the North Atlantic matters, what teleconnection stacking means, and why the coincidence of all 3 basins matters more than the magnitude of any one of them. That story takes considerably longer to tell, and the media environment that climate journalism operates in does not consistently reward longer or more technically complex stories. Complexity is not conspiracy, it is just complexity. The uncomfortable truth is that the absence of mainstream coverage of the Singh et al. Configuration is not evidence of suppression. It is evidence of a communication gap between what the peer-reviewed science has established and what the science communication infrastructure is currently translating into public discourse. And that gap, not any conspiracy, not any manipulation, not any classified weather technology, is the actual problem. Because the configuration that paper describes is assembling in real-time observational data right now, it is detectable and nameable and discussable using publicly available information, and the window in which the information is most actionable, the window before the event fully verifies, when preparation and awareness still have the most value, is the window we are currently in. That is the question the data is raising. Not a hidden question, not a suppressed question. A question sitting in a peer-reviewed journal published in 2018, written by scientists who did the hard work of attribution, describing the mechanism behind the worst climate catastrophe in the modern record, and now pattern matching in real time against ocean observations that anyone with a browser can verify. That is not a conspiracy. That is a finding. And the only reason it feels like a secret is that not enough people have been saying it out loud. Now, we need to sit with what happens if the finding is right. Part 15. If it verifies. Suppose the forecast verifies. Suppose the spring predictability barrier recedes over the next 2 months, and the ensemble spread narrows and the trade winds weaken, and the Kelvin waves complete their eastward transit, and the Niño 3.4 index crosses positive 2.0 degrees Celsius by October, and keeps climbing toward positive 2.2 by December. Suppose the Indian Ocean dipole commits to a positive phase in September and October, precisely when the El Niño is approaching its peak. Suppose the North Atlantic remains anomalously warm, as it has been for 2 years, and the atmospheric teleconnections from that warmth compound the circulation anomalies that the Pacific and Indian Ocean forcings are independently driving. Suppose the multi-basin alignment that Singh et al. Described in the 1876-78 record assembles itself in the global ocean in the second half of 2026. What does the world look like? The physical impacts would be real, measurable, and significant. Global mean temperature would spike. The 2026 annual mean global temperature would almost certainly set a new record, potentially by a substantial margin, because Super El Niño events add roughly 0.2 to 0.4 degrees Celsius to the global mean temperature in the year of their peak, and the year following, on top of an already record-warm baseline. The 2023 and 2024 global temperature records have already been broken sequentially. A Super El Niño peak in 2026 would almost certainly extend that sequence and push global temperatures further above the 1.5 degrees Celsius Paris Agreement threshold that the international climate community has identified as a target for limiting worst-case impacts. Regional drought and rainfall patterns would reorganize dramatically. The historical teleconnection record for strong El Niño events is fairly consistent. Reduced rainfall across South Asia during the monsoon season, reduced rainfall across sub-Saharan Africa and northeastern Brazil, reduced rainfall across Australia and parts of Southeast Asia, and enhanced rainfall across the eastern tropical Pacific, parts of East Africa, and the southern tier of the United States. Each of those rainfall anomalies, in a world 7% more moisture-laden than the pre-industrial climate, would be correspondingly more intense in both its wet and its dry expression. The droughts would be drier, the floods would be wetter, the departures from the climatological norm would be larger. The food system stress I described earlier would begin to materialize in agricultural outcomes before the El Niño reaches its peak. Monsoon rainfall anomalies in South Asia typically emerge in June through September. If the IOD is already positive and the Pacific warming is already underway, the atmospheric forcing over South Asia in the summer of 2026 could be measurable in crop conditions by July. Sub-Saharan. African rainfall anomalies associated with El Niño-related circulation changes typically emerge in the October through December season. The timeline of compounding agricultural stress, if the alignment verifies, would unfold over roughly 6 to 12 months, giving commodity markets, food policy institutions, and international aid organizations advance notice of the kind of shock they are facing. The cascading effects beyond the agricultural sector would include energy demand increases from heat waves across Asia, infrastructure stress from extreme precipitation events in the enhanced rainfall zones, public health impacts from heat waves, particularly in urban areas across South and Southeast Asia, and economic disruptions from the combination of commodity price spikes and reduced productivity in climate-sensitive sectors. In the poorest countries, particularly those in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where climate sensitivity is highest and adaptive capacity is lowest, these impacts would disproportionately concentrate. In wealthier countries, the impacts would be real but largely economic rather than directly physical. What would not happen is a direct replay of 1877. Let me be explicit and honest about this, because the invocation of 50 million deaths demands honesty about what it does and does not imply for the present. The mortality of 1877 was produced by the specific intersection of a climate event with a specific set of governance failures, colonial extraction, ideological rigidity about market intervention, and the absence of international humanitarian infrastructure. Those specific failure modes are not the dominant risk in 2026. The international humanitarian system, however imperfect, exists. National food security programs, however unequal, exist. Early warning systems that did not exist in 1877 now detect monsoon deficits and issue food security alerts weeks in advance. The direct mortality from famine that Victorian colonial administration allowed is not the primary risk. But that is not the same as saying the modern system is immune to the stress a verified triple basin alignment would impose. The modern system has its own vulnerabilities, and they are not smaller than Victorian vulnerabilities, they are different. A globally synchronized food price spike that takes place within a commodity market system that operates in real time, that is accessible to high-income buyers and inaccessible to low-income buyers, that transmits the shock from the production region to the consumption region in hours rather than weeks. That is a different kind of vulnerability from Victorian colonial extraction, but it is a vulnerability. Political systems that are already under pressure from inequality, polarization, and post-pandemic stress would receive food price shocks on top of existing fragilities. The geopolitical stability of regions already stressed by water insecurity and agricultural vulnerability, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, would be further tested. These are not scenarios from science fiction. They are scenarios with recent historical precedents in the 2010-11 food price spike and the 2022 commodity disruptions following the war in Ukraine. The realistic impact of a verified Super El Niño with triple basin alignment in 2026 is not 50 million deaths. It is a global economic shock of significant magnitude, disproportionately absorbed by the world's most vulnerable populations, occurring at a moment when the institutional and political systems responsible for managing such shocks are already under considerable strain. That outcome would not produce Victorian-scale mortality, but it would be a genuine and significant stress test of the modern world's capacity to manage synchronized global climate disruption, a test that the modern system has not faced at this magnitude before, and for which its preparation is uneven and incomplete. Part 16. The Real Unknown. Let me bring you back to where we started. The Oceanic Niño Index is sitting at negative 0.16 degrees Celsius. The ocean is quiet, or appears to be. The CFSV2 is projecting positive 2.1 to 2.2 degrees Celsius at peak. The NMME agrees. The IRI shows 70% and rising El Niño probability during the period of historically lowest forecast skill. The subsurface Western Pacific warm pool is sitting at 29 to 30 degrees Celsius and moving eastward in Kelvin waves that won't register at the surface for months. The Indian Ocean is trending positive IOD. The North Atlantic is anomalously warm for the second consecutive year, and a peer-reviewed paper published in the Journal of Climate in 2018 says that the last time all three of those basins aligned simultaneously in this configuration, somewhere between 30 and 50 million people died. None of that means history is repeating. Let me say that one more time plainly. The data right now does not predict a famine. No scientist I'm aware of is claiming it does. The models carry significant uncertainty. The spring predictability barrier is real. The 2014 analogue exists. There are multiple plausible scenarios in which the forecast does not verify at Super El Niño magnitude, or in which the IOD does not commit to a positive phase, or in which the Atlantic teleconnection to the Pacific Indian Ocean forcing is weaker than the 1877 record implies. These are genuine and non-trivial possibilities. What the data does show is something more specific than a prediction of catastrophe, and in some ways more important. It shows the early assembly of the specific configuration that climate science has identified as the mechanism behind the most lethal climate event in the modern record, visible in real time in publicly available observations during a period when the forecasting systems we have built specifically to detect it are pointing at the same outcome from independent starting points. The question that no model can answer is not whether the configuration will materialize. The models are working on that, and we will know more in 2 months than we know today. The question no model can answer is what happens to the modern world if it does. Because the modern world, its supply chains, its commodity markets, its food security architecture, its political systems, its international institutions, was not built to handle a stress test of this specific kind. It was not designed with a verified triple basin alignment as a design parameter. The engineers of the global food system, and the architects of the international humanitarian system, and the designers of the commodity trading infrastructure, and the writers of national food security policies, none of them had the Singh et al. Analysis on their desks when they were building what they built. Most of them still don't. The 1877 catastrophe was not inevitable. It was not written in the physics of the climate system alone. The 50 million who died did not have to die from a drought that failed monsoons across 2 continents. They died because the climate created a stress, and the human systems of their time failed under that stress, in ways that were specific to the institutions, ideologies, and power structures of the Victorian era. The drought created the pressure. The systems determined the outcome. The 2026 version of that question, if the configuration verifies if the pressure materializes, is not about Victorian colonial policy. It is about just-in-time supply chains and commodity market dynamics and export restrictions and food price volatility and humanitarian funding capacity and the political will of governments facing domestic food security pressure to prioritize global humanitarian response. It is about whether the modern system, which is genuinely more capable than the Victorian system in most respects, is capable enough in the specific ways that a synchronized global agricultural shock would test. And the honest answer is, we don't know. We have never run the experiment. We have never subjected the modern global food system to the full stress of a verified triple basin alignment at Super El Niño magnitude. We have partial analogues, the 2010-11 spike, the 2022 disruptions, but none of them carried the full magnitude and synchronization that the Singh et al. Configuration implies. The spring predictability barrier will fall. The ensemble spread will narrow. The trade winds will show us whether they are weakening or recovering. The Indian Ocean will show us whether the IOD is committing. The North Atlantic will show us whether its warmth is coupling to the global circulation in the way the historical record suggests it can. Over the next 60 to 90 days, the forecast will resolve in a way that it cannot today. We will know more. The signal will either clarify into something that demands serious attention from every institution that touches food security, economic stability, or humanitarian response, or it will soften into a strong but sub-Super El Niño that produces significant but manageable regional impacts. But here is the thing about knowing more in 60 to 90 days. The systems that would need to respond to a verified triple basin alignment, the agricultural commodity reserves, the international food security monitoring networks, the humanitarian prepositioning of aid and resources, the policy frameworks for export restriction coordination, all of them have longer lead times than 60 to 90 days. The lag between climate signal detection and effective systemic response is measured not in weeks, but in seasons, which means the window for preparation is not the window for certainty. The window for preparation is now, not because the outcome is certain, but because the cost of preparing for an event that doesn't fully verify is small relative to the cost of failing to prepare for one that does. The models aren't predicting a famine, they're predicting a test. They're saying the ocean is loading, the basins are moving, the configuration is assembling, and somewhere in the next 6 months, we'll find out whether the physics cooperates and the atmosphere couples and the Indian Ocean commits, and the triple alignment fully materializes. And if it does, the only question that will matter is not whether we saw it coming. The data shows we could have. The question will be whether we were watching carefully enough to act, while there was still time to make a difference. Whether the institutions and systems we have built to manage planetary scale stress were designed to respond to a signal that is forming right now, visible in publicly available data, described in peer-reviewed science, and pointing at a threshold that humanity has only crossed once in the modern record and would desperately prefer not to cross again. The ocean is quiet now, but the subsurface has already made its decision. And the question of what happens when that decision reaches the surface, not just in the Pacific, but across all three basins, simultaneously, in a world that has never been tested by what they can do together, is a question that the spring of 2026 is just beginning to ask. We are going to find out the answer whether we are ready for it or not. The only thing we don't know yet is which parts of our world fail the test.